Relations Chair for ITC. I'm also the Land and Resource Officer for the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians in Roseburg, Oregon. And I have had the privilege to coordinate this workshop and work with our amazing presenters today to bring you what I think will be a really tremendous workshop. So thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to start off by thanking the Menominee Nation and the Stockbridge community for their generous support for everything that's happened this week. Can we just give them a round of applause? I also want to recognize our moderator who will be taking over here soon, Pete Wakeland, who has just been a champion in Indian country. Can we give Pete a round of applause as well? And lastly, I want to send a big thank you to George Smith, who couldn't be with us today to present. He had an illness which prevented him from flying, but George has been a tremendous advocate for self-determination. We call him Captain Itara around the Itara Circle. He's just been an advocate for development of the Indian Trust Asset Management Plans. Can we give George a round of applause? So today's workshop focuses on one of the most significant developments in modern federal Indian policy, the continued expansion of tribal self-governance and self-determination. These concepts are far more than administrative tools or federal program authorities. They represent the ongoing effort of tribal nations to exercise inherent sovereignty through direct management and decision-making over tribal lands, natural resources, programs, and governmental functions. As ITC Executive Director Cal Makamoto said last night in his remarks to ITC membership, one of the foundational pillars for the formation of the Intertribal Timber Council was to promote Indian self-determination and self-governance. We've come a long way, but we have a long way to go. Over the past several decades, tribes across Indian country have increasingly utilized contracts, compacts, cooperative agreements, and other authorities under Public Law 93-638 and other related legislation to assume responsibilities that were historically carried out by federal agencies. This shift reflects an important evolution in the federal-tribal relationship. It recognizes that tribal governments are best positioned to determine their priorities, respond to their community needs, and manage their resources in ways that reflect tribal values, traditions, and long-term objectives. This transition has been particularly important in tribal forestry and natural resource management. Tribal forests are among the most sustainably managed forests in the country, and many tribes have demonstrated that locally driven management systems can produce strong ecological, economic, and cultural outcomes simultaneously. Tribal management approaches often integrate science, traditional ecological knowledge, cultural stewardship, and long-range planning in ways that strengthen resiliency and improve forest health over time. The findings from the Indian Forest Management Assessment Team's fourth assessment reinforce the growing importance of self-governance and determination in Indian country. During tribal visits conducted as part of the assessment, approximately 80% of the tribes visited reported that they are participating in some form of self-governance, compacting, or contracting. This reflects a substantial movement towards direct tribal administration and implementation of forestry and natural resource programs, and demonstrates the increasing trust tribes are placing in their own institutions and management systems over the federal systems. At the same time, IFMAT 4 also identified important challenges and opportunities associated with this transition. The report noted that many of the foundational federal policies, regulations, and organizational structures were developed long before the current era of expanded tribal self-governance and may no longer fully reflect the realities of modern tribal forest management. The report repeatedly points to the need for federal systems to evolve alongside tribal self-governance by improving flexibility, clarifying roles and authorities, supporting implementation of key authorities like ITARA, the Indian Trust Asset Reform Act, strengthening, training, technical assistance, and reevaluating the federal role in relation to tribes that are increasingly carrying out forestry and natural resource operations directly. We're also beginning to see a broader recognition, including bipartisan support at the national level, that many of the success demonstrated through tribal self-governance may hold important lessons for the management of adjacent federal lands. Increasingly, policymakers, agencies, and local communities are recognizing the value of place-based stewardship, collaborative management, strategic partnerships, and local solutions to local problems. Tribes bring generations of experience managing landscapes in ways that balance ecological health, economic use, cultural protection, and long-term sustainability. One of the most important lessons tribal stewardship offers is the importance of generational management, thinking long-term. Effective forest and resource management cannot be driven solely by short political timelines, harmful fads, shifting administrative priorities, or temporary management trends. Healthy forests and resilient ecosystems require consistency, adaptability, and a long-term commitment to future generations. Tribal approaches to landscape-scale stewardship have long emphasized responsibility to the next generation, sustained ecosystem health, and resilience over time. Those principles are becoming increasingly important as we confront wildfire, drought, declining forest conditions, watershed degradation, and other climate-related challenges across Indian country and across our federal ownership. Throughout today's session, we'll explore the foundations of self-governance authorities and 638 mechanisms, review key legal and policy frameworks, discuss emerging legislative opportunities, and federal alignment efforts. We'll hear directly from tribal practitioners about real-world implementation of some of these authorities and tools, including the successes, the challenges, and lessons learned. Our goal today is not only to better understand the technical and legal aspects of self-governance, but also to frame self-governance within the broader context of tribal sovereignty, nation rebuilding, long-term stewardship, and the future of tribal and federal resource management partnerships. I want to thank you all again for joining us today, and with that, I'd like to turn things over to our moderator, Pete Wakeland.
Good morning. Yeah, you guys can see I'm not dead. I'm still here. Just kind of, I'm sure everybody knows, like, restrooms are just in the hallway. We're gonna be going back over to the casino for lunch. There'll be a shuttle, or you guys can drive or walk or however you want to do it, and then we'll come back over here afterward. Can you guys hear me? I tend to not talk too loud. Okay, we're going to start off here. Thanks, Jason. Good job. We're going to combine the first two things on the agenda for today because as George couldn't be here. There's going to be a segment on foundations of self-governance and then legal and policy frameworks. And we're going to have Brian Gunn and Sara Clark present that material. A little bit about Brian. Brian's the principal in the Powers, Pyles, Sutter, and Verville Indian Tribal Governments Group. He's a member of the Confederated Tribes of Colville Reservation. Brian works on a variety of issues for tribal clients in the U.S. Congress and federal agencies. Brian specializes in matters of the federal budget and appropriations, natural resources, federal lands, and federal land transfers, taxation, energy development, and Indian health. It's hard to be a specialist in all of that. Brian was the lead lobbyist for the 2016 Indian Trust Asset Reform Act and other tribal standalone bills and tribal provisions, including in larger bills that have been enacted since. Brian was formerly a partner at Drinker, Biddle, and Reith LLP. He received his law degree from the University of Washington, boo, and a bachelor from Washington State University. Glad to have Brian here with us today. Sara is a partner at Shute, Mihaly. I'm probably butchering this. Weinberger. It's a public interest law firm in San Francisco. Her practice involves representation of tribes, indigenous organizations, and land trusts on a variety of matters involving culture and natural resource protection and support for tribal self-determination and sovereignty. Her work has recently focused on supporting cultural fire practitioners as prescribed fire advocates put more good fire on the ground by advising fire collaboratives, developing reports and strategic plans, providing subject matter expertise, and advancing policy solutions. She also serves on the board of directors to Save the Redwoods League. So with that, I would ask them to come up and present the material. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Sara Clark. It's Shute, Mihaly, and Weinberger. You don't need to know that, but that's the pronunciation. So I am going to start. You're going to see a lot of me today because we've had some cancellations and Jason asked me to fill in. And so I'm going to be presenting a number of materials from George and then go into some of the other work that I had originally signed up for. So I'm asking you to bear with me. I'm going to start with a fair amount of overview of various tribal self-governance and self-determination and provisions, and then get into more specifics. There are many experts in this room, and I come at this largely from a legal perspective, so certainly feel free to ask questions. Feel free to share your experiences and on-the-ground examples as we go through things. I'll note that often in this space, we see things that are written in the law as one way, and then we see how things are implemented in a different way. And so some of the stuff that I'm less familiar with as a practitioner, I'm sure you may have differing opinions or experiences with. So to start things out, we are going to cover, kind of in two parts, a lot of the background related to this topic. So I'm going to walk through a brief timeline of how we got to the present day and what statutes and authorities are relevant in this space. And then I'm going to spend some time actually breaking those authorities down for tribal management of forest lands. We're going to be talking about both tribal trust lands as well as adjacent federally administered lands. And as Jason highlighted, this is a really important area for Indian country. We're not just talking about a few tribes that are engaging in tribal self-government and self-determination. Instead, it's more than 80% of tribal forest acres are being managed in part or fully under the 638 authorities. And so, as I said, many of you likely have a lot of experience in this realm. So George outlined these 6 principles, or these principles that are set forth in sort of the 6 statutes. And I thought it was a good place to start in grounding about what exactly we're talking about here. So first we have to note that, of course, all of these self-governance principles are rooted in the tribal trust relationship. And that tribal trust relationship stems from the Constitution and other authorities and forms the backdrop of why tribes have this special relationship with the federal government. In the modern era, we see that the United States supports and recognizes the rights of tribes to self-governance and supports tribal sovereignty and self-determination in various ways. I note that that support is not always full and not always fully implemented, and we'll talk about some of those tensions and challenges. And we see that the intention here was to really start to transfer programs that the federal government was running for Indian tribes over to tribes to run themselves. And the ways that has happened has varied. It's been in fits and starts, and we've seen it approached differently across the different agencies. The intention here, in part, was because we've seen, since really the Reagan era, a desire to shrink the federal government. And so, in part, some of this effort is to provide an orderly transition away from the federal government providing services to the tribes providing them themselves. This is, of course, in tension to the fact that due to the trust relationship, it can't just be that tribes fend for themselves without resources or support. And so this sometimes is in tension between the federal government wanting to just cut services versus needing to support tribes in running their own services. And then at the bottom, we see that over time, we've seen a trend towards trying to promote administrative discretion to the greatest extent feasible. Brian's going to talk a lot about ITARA, which is really the crown centerpiece of that. But we'll talk about the ways in which that is happening and isn't happening across the other authorities as well. Okay, so the brief timeline. So ISDEA was enacted in 1975. I hadn't made that connection that ISDEA and ITC like right at the same time frame. So thanks, Jason, for pointing that out. It's a neat fact to know. And I want to know more about the history of like when and how that all happened, but that's not for me to cover. And so this is really the genesis of tribal self-determination. And I'll just note for those of you that are really new to this area, you'll hear the term 638, and you might wonder, like, where did that come from? It's because the Indian Self-Determination Education Assistance Act public law number is 93-638, and so to 638 something is referring to this statute. In 1988, we start to see some amendments to ISDEA. Really relevant here is it's creating the Tribal Self-Governance Demonstration Project, which was originally an experiment with only 20 tribes participating. And this is where we get compacting. This is the beginning of the compacting authority, where we start to see tribes really taking on not just projects, but instead programs. I should have said, apologies, at the beginning, that ISDEA at its core, what it is intending to do is to ensure the meaningful and effective participation of Indian people in the planning, conduct, and administration of federal programs and services. So at its core, what it's doing is allowing tribes to assume control over certain federal programs using federal funds. It's a transfer of authority from the federal government to tribes. And in the initial conception in 1975, that was really around contracts, so contracts for individual programs. What the 1988 amendments did is starting to layer in the idea of compacting for a wider suite of services with greater tribal autonomy and control. We're going to take a brief segue out of self-determination because we're at ITC, and we're going to focus on forest resources. And just mention that in 1990, the National Indian Forest Resource Management Act was passed. This governs the treatment of forest resources on tribal trust lands. It's the primary statute in federal law that really guides how tribes and their partners at BIA are supposed to be implementing forestry programs on those tribal trust lands. We have some specific statutory requirements around sustained yield, tribal objectives, and trust responsibility that all come out in the statute. But at its core, it's modeled in part after the planning and decision-making structures of other federal land management agencies, requiring advanced planning, advanced decision-making to determine how resources will be treated, and then a series of steps in order to actually implement those plans on the ground. And I'll note that there's a specific authorization in NFIRMA, this is the tieback, for the Secretary to undertake forest management activities under ISDEA. So we get tribes that are able to use ISDEA authorities to actually implement NFIRMA. I also have to say, this is a session that is ripe with acronyms. Hopefully you guys are all following along. If you are like, what are you talking about, raise your hand and ask. Okay. Then in 1994, we start to see some additional significant amendments, and in particular, we move to a full program of self-governance, allowing tribes to negotiate annual funding agreements, consolidate their programs, and reallocate funding based on tribal priorities. So we moved from the 1988 amendments, where more in a demonstration, 20 tribes only, to now having a broader authority. There's still limits on the number of tribes to be added, but it is we haven't hit those. The other thing in 1994 is we have Title IV and the possibility of tribal management on DOI administered lands. So we're going to talk more about how that works in a minute, but I want to note that that is where those amendments come in. In 2016, we get ITARA, and I'm just going to put a placeholder here and say Brian will talk to us more about ITARA in a minute. But it is a major advancement in allowing tribes not only to take over authority, but to actually decide how those authorities are going to be run. In 2018, we get through the Farm Bill, enabling the use of 638 contracts for Tribal Forest Protection Act projects on certain national forest system and BLM lands. And so this is an expansion again of the ISDIA authorities over to other federal land management agencies. And then finally in 2020 we have the Progress Act, which is really a procedural mechanism. It did a lot of procedural cleanup to try and make self-governance work better. It sought a sort of consistent statutory framework for all of the self-governance compacts, including sort of steps to limit the reasons why why DOI can turn them down, and when DOI can make amendments to those in an effort to be more protective of tribal determination. And the rulemaking on that finished fairly recently in December 2024. So that's the history. Those are the main steps that Congress has taken in this realm. And so if you are trying to figure out how we got to where we got to today, these are the steps that provides the way there. So then I'm going to talk a bit about where we are today and what authorities can be used and how they can be used for management of the two different kind of types of land. So first, focusing on management of tribal trust land. So first, under 638, this allows transfer of authority from BIA to tribes for management of federal or of Indian forest lands, tribal trust lands. This includes transfer of programs, functions, services, or authorities, the PFSAs, another acronym, that the agencies would have otherwise provided directly to tribes or tribal citizens. So it's an ability to take BIA forestry programs or fire programs and to move them over and through a contract mechanism. Under the law, tribal entities are entitled to the amount equal to what the federal agency would have otherwise spent operating the program, in addition to contract support costs. This funding can be more flexible than other mechanisms to shift money from the federal government to tribes through things like, if you're familiar with GNA, Good Neighbor Authority, or other kind of cooperative programs, in part because it comes in advance, it can be reallocated, and you can carry over unspent funds. But there is also, this is the place where what the law says and what happens on the ground don't feel like they meet, because there's significant difficulty in actually getting this amount of money. The tribal shares process at BIA created tribal priority allocations. Those sort of locked in the amount that tribes could receive through their 638 contracts, and that doesn't reflect the current need or the efficiency of tribes in actually getting work done. And so there's a massive and well-documented gap between the tribal priority allocations that are available and the actual operational costs that tribes have in running these programs. But nevertheless, 92% of tribes have contracts under 638, Title I, and BIA administers more than 9,500 contracts across Indian country, so really a massive number of them. If tribes are interested in this, then tribes make the proposal. If the proposal meets criteria that are laid out, then the agency and the tribe have only 90 days to negotiate the contract and annual funding requirement. There's a model annual funding agreement. Tribes can negotiate additional provisions, but it's supposed to be quick and it is supposed to be mandatory. So if you're going under that Title I contract authority, it is supposed to, in today's day, be more tribally centered, in that if tribes want to do it, the federal government should come along. It then imposes a bunch of provisions on tribes to ensure financial oversight, audits, that sort of thing. Contracts, there's special termination provisions. Basically, once a contract has been entered into, then it can be terminated for gross mismanagement, fraud, that sort of thing, or tribes can give it up through a process called retrocession. So that's Title I. That's the first authority available on tribal forest lands. We also then get Title IV, compacts for self-governance tribes. What tribal compacting does is, if tribes have met certain requirements related to planning, financial controls, then they can create a compact that really brings one agreement to all of the programs, forestry, but other things as well that the tribes want to take on under 638 authorities. These self-governance compacts generally expand the types of programs and responsibilities that can be included within them. They minimize financial or federal oversight to a certain extent, and they increase tribal flexibility to redesign programs and reallocate resources from what the federal government was doing to what they want to do, again, to a certain extent. They're administered by the DOI's Office of Self-Governance. And again, we have widespread uptake and adoption of this. Over half of federally recognized tribes have self-governance compacts and are engaged as self-governance tribes. And in 2024, over $700 million moved through self-governance compacts. So they're really quite widespread. One thing to note about the compacting that's different than Title I is that this is not as mandatory. And so the ability to get through the process leaves more discretion with the DOI agencies and with the Office of Self-Governance, and it imposes some additional provisions related to federal oversight. So all of this sounds very good on paper. It sounds like tribes can take over things and get that transfer of authority and then run their own programs. But there's a couple of things to watch out for, and one I'll highlight right now, which is the concept of inherently federal functions. So in ISDEA, there's a very strange kind of circular reference, which basically says the agencies can transfer their authority to tribes except for inherently federal functions. What are inherently federal functions? Things that the agencies can't lawfully transfer to tribes. Like, okay, what does that mean? Like, what is the basis? And I'll say that if you look at the underpinning of this from a legal perspective, what the federal government was concerned about is the subdelegation doctrine. What the subdelegation doctrine says is basically the federal government can't, so first you have Congress, and it can delegate legislative authority to executive branch agencies. That's delegation. Then those executive branch agencies can take their authority and subdelegate it to another party. So that's what's happening here. It's a delegation of authority from the federal government to tribes under the subdelegation doctrine. And what the underlying doctrine says is subdelegation is actually fine if there's intelligible principles that Congress has outlined about what goes too far and what is allowed. But in ISDEA, we didn't get intelligible principles. We just got this weird circular definition. And so for DOI in particular, what they will tell you is we determine this on a case-by-case basis. We look at all the facts to determine when an agency has gone too far in delegating its authority and when it's just enough. I think this creates a lot of uncertainty in Indian country, and I think it creates a real tension that tribes have to navigate in determining how much authority they can take on. And it is highlighting some of the tensions between the trust responsibility in which the federal government maintains this kind of important but sometimes paternalistic attitude towards tribes with the concepts of self-governance. So we'll talk more about that in a bit. But the next thing that I wanted to highlight is the ways in which, and let Brian highlight, is the ways in which we've tried to move towards tribes having more autonomy. So I'm going to let Brian talk about ITARA.
Thanks, Sarah. Oh, that's pretty loud. Can everybody hear me okay and not hurt themselves? All right. Again, Brian Gunn. Glad to be here. I've never been to ITC before, so I appreciate the invite. Born and raised in the Colville Reservation. I've got a lot of family who have worked in forest products, so I've always wanted to come, and here I am. So I get to talk about ITARA. I also serve, in addition to, I guess, being a lawyer lobbyist guy, I'm the co-chair of the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians Trust Reform Committee. It's kind of one of those jobs you get when you're out of the room and somebody nominates you. But going back about 15 years ago, the Trust Reform Committee, who was under the leadership of the then vice chair of the Coeur d'Alene tribe, Ernie Stensgar, kind of did the most of the drafting of ITARA. And just very historical thing on how it came about. We ended up, at the time, the Cobell case had finished, and we were trying to see what of the legislative proposals out there still had legs or made a certain amount of sense. And we focused on 3 titles of a bill that I'll talk about, Title II, which this trust asset demonstration project. The thought was that you've got ISDEA that allows tribes to get money to do things that the government would otherwise do. But ITARA, we were thinking that these agreements would allow tribes to actually change substantively how their assets were managed, and that was really the intent. And so, I know that Matt is going to do a presentation about some amendments that are pending. Looking back, we would have done certain things differently, I think. I think there's a certain amount of reticence, and I'll talk a little bit about this when we do the second half of the presentation about, I think, some of the shortcomings of the agencies in administering or implementing a law like this, where tribes are intended to have a lot of authority, yet the agency's reflex is to administer it as narrowly as possible and to create various obstacles. But it's a good law. We've got, Cow Creek has been a great example. I think it'll be a good law for years to come. And Sarah, I can tip this back to you, and we can get on to the second. Sure. Yeah. I'm a little kind of get freaked out by this thing here. Is this? All right. I've got two of them. That's the problem. All right. Is this the surround sound version? Okay, I got it. All right. Well, I hope this is, less hard on your ears. A little bit about some of the challenges that I've seen with how it's been implemented, ITAR has been implemented. First is sort of the definition of trust assets. When we were drafting this, we intentionally didn't identify what trust assets. We didn't have a definition for trust assets because at the time, the department, and this is under the Obama administration, they were very much wanting us to list them out in the statute. But we knew that if we did that there would be pressure to eliminate oil and gas and traditional energy resources that the administration at the time wasn't too jazzed about. So we very much resisted that. We thought that a base definition of trust assets would suffice. And ironically, we ended up adding the part about extending Hearth Act treatment, and that's the law that allows tribes to enter into or to promulgate lease regulations and enter into leases with third parties without getting BI approval. We extended that to forest management activities from NFRMA. And we kind of did that as an afterthought, actually. We thought, well, this kind of came from the Northwest. There's a number of timber tribes here. It makes sense to maybe sort of as an added benefit extend that authority to NFRMA. And out of that, we ended up with, I guess, an interpretation or an informal, at least, position that the law only applies to surface leases and to forest resources in terms of trust assets. And I know Matt will talk a little bit about this, but there have been tribes that have, over the years in the last decade, that have tried to put forward other types of trust resources that they would like to see managed differently, only to be told, no, that's not one that we'll approve because it's not a forestry resource. Again, one of the challenges that I see. There's another unrelated part of the law that hasn't been talked about all that much, but it was a big deal at the time, at least for me, and that's Title III. Title III dealt with restructuring of the Office of the Special Trustee. Anybody here know what OST did when they were called OST? I used to do work with OST a lot, and I could maybe identify of the 600 people that they had, I could identify what about maybe 70 did. There was just a lot of warm bodies over there that accumulated during the time the Cobell case was being litigated. They were kind of sitting around in BI regional offices, kind of looking at spinning around their chair, from what I could tell. I mean, not to be pejorative, but honestly, I worked as closely with that agency as probably anybody, and I really didn't know what a lot of these individuals did other than they were occupying space in BI regional offices. So our thought there was to essentially require the department to come up with a transition plan to transition OST into something else, but identify the functions for reallocation elsewhere. So we went through this big exercise of identifying a whole bunch of functions at OST that we would like to see moved over to the trust resources part of the BIA budget, like on-the-ground foresters, realty people, people who are actually doing stuff. So that was a big part of it as well. Another part of the bill, which is within the same title, was intended to address a problem getting evaluations of trust property, which has reemerged again. Anybody here own Indian land, like with relatives, friends? Anybody lease land? I own land in Omak, Washington, and was going through an exercise about 20 years ago of trying to get an appraisal to sell some to my father. And to get the appraisal, it took 2.5 years to get it. And part of the reason is that at the time, the regime was that the Bureau of Indian Affairs would request an appraisal from the Office of the Special Trustee, who would then be tasked with either doing the appraisal themselves or contracting it to somebody else. The problem was that you oftentimes, if the BI superintendent had a lot on their plate, they wouldn't transmit the request over. So, you're calling, Brian Gunn's calling, well, where's my appraisal? They said, well, the BI never sent it over. So we had this provision in the law that was intended to really make sure that the requester and the people who prepared the appraisal were under the same roof. Somehow, some way, despite my pleas to the contrary, the department implemented it in such a way to where they moved all Indian appraisals to the department level. And so now we're competing for valuations with BLM, NPS, and a bunch of guys who have since taken the deferred resignation program, and our appraisal wait is longer than it's ever been. So anyway, just a complaint. But another part of ITARA that is out there that hasn't been talked about too much.
Question. Go for it. Can you say again what those appraisals are? Sorry, I missed that. Is it like real estate appraisals for like acquisitions?
It's for all of them.
So like we do appraisals on timber sales. Like,
Timber sales are a little bit different, but they still need to be signed off on, right, by the Bureau. So these are for anything else, anything. Cell towers, business leases, rights of way, any appraisal where a tribe hasn't contracted the function, it goes through this process of making a request, getting in the queue, and you really can't effectuate a lease or get a transaction accomplished until you have it, unless you waive the valuation. Which, if you're an individual, you can. If you're a tribe, you can.
Thank you. Okay. So this is a chart that will be in your materials that sort of goes through in specificity the different rules that apply when you have BIA direct service. So that's when there's no self-determination or self-governance things in place. If you have a Title I agreement, that's the second column. If you have a Title IV compact, that's the third column. And then if you have an ITAMP approved under ITARA, then that's the last column. And I'll just note that a lot of this is about like what the federal government does, and what you'll see is we start to get to a lot of no's once you are in the ITARA column. That's all things that are should be left to the tribes. Okay. So then the last I wanted to talk about was management on federally administered lands, so Forest Service, BLM, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and how over time we've seen the expansion of 638 authorities onto these federally administered lands to allow tribes to take on programs that were otherwise being implemented by those agencies. So first, as I noted, in 1994, we got, when Title IV was enacted, we have the ability for tribes to include in their self-governance compacts control over, oh God, I didn't even touch anything. We'll try that one there. Okay. Okay, I was lying. Yeah, that's true. So they could take control over non-BIA programs, functions, services, and authorities at DOI. And generally those have to include special geographic, historical, or cultural significance to the tribes. So this has the potential to unlock the ability for tribes to step into management shoes at these DOI land management agencies, Park Service, again, Fish and Wildlife Service, and BLM. DOI every year has to publish an annual list of all of the activities that are eligible for potential inclusion in a self-governance annual funding agreement. If you look in the Federal Register, you can see that, and they're incredibly broad. You look and you're like, BLM lists like basically everything they do, they say is potentially eligible for a Title IV compact. But in reality, getting to yes and getting to agreement on that has been harder. It's not a mandatory program, and land management agencies, for the most part, have been relatively reticent to enter into these agreements unless tribes have had really good working relationships with their relative land management agency in the first place. I do think this has the potential to be an option as the federal government continues to look to reduce the federal bureaucracy and to try and find new partners to run things on public lands. But again, it hasn't been super widely used since 1994. And then we have TFPA and 638 contracts for National Forest System lands. So the Tribal Forest Protection Act was a mechanism that allows tribes to make proposals to engage in basically forest restoration projects and other forestry projects on forest system lands if they are adjacent to tribal trust lands and if there is a threat on the National Forest System lands that could pose a problem to those to the trust lands. Those threats include wildfire, they include disease and infestation, and so basically anything where if something bad happens on adjacent Forest Service land and it could then harm tribal trust resources, that's the kind of thing that's eligible for a TFPA project. What we got in 2018 was a statement that, or legislation that authorizes 638 mechanisms to be used to implement TFPA projects. So you have two things. You have the TFPA authority, which is how you get to do the work on National Forest System lands, and then you get 638, which is how you get the funding to do the work on those lands. So they are 638 contracts, and they must be for projects proposed under the TFPA. Those projects, I'll say, in practice, you can be quite broad about them. On Monday, we were hearing from Pyles about their really broad TFPA projects where, like, even the initial planning and community involvement in an idea for potential treatment on 90,000 acres could be a project under TFPA. It doesn't have to be something super specific, but it is still just contracting authority. As of November 2023, so it's a little bit outdated, we had 22 agreements totaling $41.7 million, but I know the number has gone up a bit since then. So that's how we get to using 638 authorities on federal lands. We'll talk a little bit later about making things to match a little bit more through potential new legislation. So before Brian and I transition to the next part of this presentation, I just wanted to give sort of my overview and thoughts on where we are now and where we see sort of the legal and policy framework having evolved over time. So tribes, I think, have gained significant opportunities for administrative control over programs, functions, services, authorities that the federal government's once provided. But we still see so many structural problems that are holding us back from really realizing full self-governance. Of course, I think at the very core here is a lack of funding, and that has been a real persistent issue that I don't think we've found solutions for. The If Not report is a great resource for documenting and explaining why the funding levels that we have right now are not allowing tribes to fully exercise self-governance and really are not meeting the full trust responsibility. We also have patchwork lands. So for many tribes, we see that their ancestral lands are not just tribal trust lands, of course. Instead, they're patchworked between different agencies that all have different authorities and different mechanisms. And then you throw in, you have state and private lands as well. And I love being a lawyer, but I also hate how lawyers have to make things so complicated in every step of the way. And it feels like when you're going through a big review of the ISDEA authorities, what I am reminded of is just like, we couldn't come up with a simple system that says, let tribes do what they've known how to do since time immemorial. And instead we have to have massive amounts of regulations and hoops for everyone to jump through. And I really wish we could be thinking about ways to simplify that, but with every I think Itara is a good example where it is intended to get tribes into the self-governance seat, and you have to go through like 10 different hoops in order to get there. And so that's just the reality of legislation, and every time we go through Congress, it gets more complicated, but I think that is something that's preventing true self-governance. Ree mentioned the inherently federal function issue. I do think that is a place where the lack of clarity in statute is making it, is leaving it to line officers to really control whether they stay involved in tribal projects or not. And we have a real divergence across Indian country about whether you have line officers that are really engaged in the self-governance project and want to make it easier versus people who want to retain control, they want to retain their job, they view it as their responsibility to the public to really say, I'm only going to interpret this as narrowly as possible. So that's the overview. I am now, I did so good on time for doing something that was not mine. Go for it.
I just had a question if you, we had an example maybe or something that you, something where the self-governance and the government didn't see it the same way, or some program that didn't go through, or some idea where self-governance maybe wasn't working with the government, federal government?
With the federal government. I think so I'm going to talk in a minute a little bit more about tribal fire programs, and I see a lot of tension there between what BIA is saying they need to do and what tribes want to do. So I'm going to ask to put a pin in that.
So in a similar line, can you give some examples? So Itara, it defined, just any trust resource, and then like later there were applications that came through that were rejected. They like tightened that to like just forestry. Can you give some examples of some of those other trust resources that tribes tried to do under Itara but were rejected?
Do you know? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to let Brian go, and then I'm going to let Brian stay up here.
I don't know. I'm getting attacked by this mic here. So Jesus. I'm just not going to use it. Can you guys hear me okay? All right, good. It's better. I know one tribe, the Tulalip tribes in Washington State, they have a 638 contract. They get paid to do stuff under these tidelands that they have. And so they wanted to have the tidelands managed in a slightly different way, and they actually have a tidelands management plan. And they approached the department and they submitted a letter of interest. The department said, well, not really forestry stuff, so we're not. You can submit whatever you want, but it's likely not going to be approved. So they were using that sort of pre-application thing as a way of, I think, kind of talking tribes out of stuff. That's the one example that I know of. I guess I'm here. I'll talk about this, like legal frameworks. It was kind of a broad topic. I didn't really know where to go with it, but I was just going to talk about a few things that I've seen that relate to all of this that, I don't know, are my observations for whatever it is they're worth to you. And these are things that have come up mostly in the forestry context that I've talked to Matt about and others over the years that I think are potential opportunities or obstacles to, effectuating, especially some of the stuff that we're talking about in management on federal land that I see being out there. One of them, when we talk about wildfire, especially tribal wildfire suppression, is this sort of existential problem where, and I used to represent tribes on these breach of trust cases and still am, including my own. And, you'll see this pattern that evolves over the last, scores of years. Anybody know what the Indian Claims Commission was or is? There's an old Cody, I know Cody does, but it was a 5-year period back in like 1946 to 51 where tribes could submit historical claims against the United States for any number of wrongs that they endured. And it was not limited by time, but during that 5-year window you had to get your stuff in, otherwise they were going to be forever barred. Coincidentally, my grandfather was one of the named plaintiffs for the Colville tribes, and one of their claims was a fire-related claim, even back then. And so Fast forward to about 15 years ago, a number of tribes had these pending breach of trust cases against the U.S. At the end of the day, these tribes ended up getting, including Colville and others, getting some significant dollar amount settlements, which was good. But fast forward to 2015, 3 years after these tribes got paid a significant amount of money, nothing has really changed after the U.S. cut these checks, and that's because when the U.S. gets sued, the money comes out of the U.S. Treasury through this thing called the Judgment Fund. There's no sort of consequence to the Bureau or to the Department for not requesting the resources they need to do the work that gave rise to this liability. It's all kind of in the rearview mirror. There have been some cases where that's happened, and not in this context, but in others. And I see that as an impediment, because here we are again, since 2015, the Culver Reservation is 1.4 million acres, more than 800,000, close to 900,000 acres since 2015 have burned. And these are timber sales that were forecasted 30 years in the future that are having to be reallocated, moved around, cut up a bit. And so the resource just isn't there, and there's no money is gonna fix what that resource is, or fish and wildlife, or any of the cultural resources. I see that as a problem. I will say that the Judgment Fund that I've talked about, there is a requirement that's never been enforced that requires the agency that caused the liability to repay the fund. And maybe somebody should enforce that, I don't know. But it's on the books. But the OMB and the Comptroller General have never required agencies to do that, which is maybe good or bad depending on how you look at it. I was going to talk a little bit about the obstacle I see potentially to expansion, to 638 expansion to federal lands, which I think is a great idea. And this is kind of coming up in an unrelated context, but I'm seeing this in real time and more. But when tribes compact programs under self-governance specifically, more so self-governance than Title I, you're not getting increases to those programs anymore, unless Congress specifically writes it into the spending bills. Everybody had the BIA threaten to take away their program. I mean, you kind of have to take a hostage to get them to do that. It's a really a hands-off kind of thing. You've got the program, it's yours unless you reassume it. So one of the, especially in the healthcare context, forestry doesn't translate as much because when you get new inventory, your money doesn't go up anyway. But what you're seeing tribes do in the healthcare space is that, especially these smaller self-governance tribes, is that they're not getting more money for the base service. So what they're doing is they're expanding the line of services by providing more services to non-Indians. And what they're doing, and you can't blame them, is they're getting more contract support cost money from those services. Contract support costs is a fund that's an indefinite appropriation that obviously goes to doing the administrative stuff that the tribes need to carry out the contract. And it's great, but it is 50-some% of the Indian Affairs budget, and it's growing exponentially. So I guess what I'm concerned with is, for all the opportunities that there might be on federal lands, I was just talking to my colleague this morning who used to be the assistant secretary. He was saying, well, what if we moved the Indian Affairs core budgets over to the USDA? What would you think about that? I'm like, well, more money, but USDA would be inheriting an account that's growing larger and larger, and would they even want it? So I think about that kind of stuff. So Forest Service, if there were people at the Forest Service who knew kind of what contract support costs were and how they're computed, if you had that kind of knowledge base, which you probably don't, but if you did, they would probably be reticent. But if they kind of knew sort of how you could expand services in other contexts and really kind of pull money out of that account, maybe at the detriment of the agency, I think they're going to be really hands-off. So I think that's something that we're going to need to think about, is dealing with this going forward. We're dealing with it now because CSC takes so much of the budget. It's hard to get increases for things like forestry, TPA, law enforcement, other non-related stuff that's not contract support costs. This is something that I also see. And then I guess the third thing I'll mention is just within, and some of this is playing out in real time, and others who know more about it, it's kind of the migration of the wildfire accounts to the Forest Service. But traditionally, the Bureau has not had the kind of clout within the department like the other agencies do, like NPS, BLM, the big money agencies. A real world example, again, going back to these 2015 fires, Cody and I worked on this, but in 2016, like Hurricane Sandy, there were massive hurricanes that had happened, so there was this emergency supplemental that Congress was working to put together. And Colville, and it was really us and some other people within the department, Mike Black, who you may remember, who's the Bureau Director, a big ally of the tribes, really kind of went to the mat for us on this. But we were urging the department to ask Congress for more money to help with rehabilitation, reforestation, everything that relates to the on-the-ground stuff that the BIA can't get reimbursed for from the wildland fire account. We needed a bunch of money for what we knew was going to be a massive restoration project for all the acres that burned in the Pacific Northwest. And so our ask was simply that they make the request to the administration that they ask Congress for the money. And we came up with numbers, and it wasn't a giant amount of money. It was a couple $100 million, but it was small by today's standards. And but the answer ended up being no. I mean, we never got the answer, but it was no. But we learned later that it was because there had already been a deal made within the department that they had made with what was then the Republican House, that in exchange for the House appropriators giving BLM more money for sage grouse habitat, the department then would agree not to list the sage grouse, put it on as an ESA listed. So it was a deal that was cut separate from us, but our request would have gotten in front of that deal or allegedly interfere with that deal. So we ended up getting nothing. And I mean, this goes back to ITAR I talked a little bit about. In Title III, one of the things that would do, and it's still on the books, is it authorizes the creation of this Undersecretary for Indian Affairs, which is intended to be like a deputy secretary level position that was really intended to kind of address these issues of where Indian Affairs just doesn't have the institutional clout in meetings with the secretary over resources like this to have the kind of weight that I think is warranted. So, I mean, that's something that I've been talking about it for 10 years. It still hasn't happened, so maybe that goes to my effectiveness. But it's something I'd like to see happen because I don't see that problem going away. Just with where Indian Affairs budget is vis-a-vis the Park Service and sort of the land and critters kind of component of Interior's mission and tribal forestry. So those are my thoughts, Sarah.
Okay, so I'm gonna I forgot to preface because we got a question and then I didn't describe what we're doing in the second half, but I'll say it now, which is Jason had asked us to talk about sort of our experience in the ways that under self-governance we're trying to balance the obligations of the federal government with the autonomy that tribes want. And so I was going to take us through a little story around trying to get more fire use on tribal trust lands, and in particular the experiences of a number of tribes in California. So just to start, in California, most of the state is facing a really significant fire deficit. So if you look at the fire return interval that was present on the landscape prior to the Europeans arriving, we had relatively frequent fires. And what those relatively frequent fires did was they changed stand composition and structure. They reduced fuel loads. They favored species that were resilient to fire as opposed to species that were not. And so when we had Europeans arrive and the establishment of the Forest Service and CAL FIRE and other agencies, we faced fire exclusion in two ways. So one, the agency is really focused on suppression. So when we saw emissions, we see trying to put them out, 10 a.m. policy, that sort of thing. But we also saw one of the first acts that the state of California took was to criminalize the indigenous practice of burning. And so we have fire exclusion because of the removal of indigenous practices from the landscape. So fast forward to where we are today. California has had catastrophic wildfires. Year after year, it's been a little quiet for the last 2 years because of good timing of rainy season, but I think we're going to be in for a doozy this year. And tribes are really interested in restoring indigenous practices to tribal trust lands. And so looking at setting up fire programs that are really diverse across the spectrum. You have tribes that are really mirroring former BIA programs or BLM programs or Forest Service programs. They're getting their employees red carded through the National Wildfire Coordinating Group. They're developing NWCG burn plans. They're really following kind of the fire project that the federal government has engaged in. And then you have tribes like Karuk, who I work a lot with, that are trying to retain an indigenous approach to fire management using cultural fire, following indigenous practice, knowledge practice and belief systems, trying to do it under tribal law. And so within that diversity, there's just a real interest in restoring fire to tribal trust lands and trying to figure out the way to do it. What has happened is we have some tribes that still have BIA direct services. Largely on those landscapes, like nothing is happening. BIA is not interested in returning fire in the way that tribes are interested, or due to staffing cuts, really doing much at all. And then you have tribes that have engaged in either Title I or Title IV ISDEA authorities in order to take on those responsibilities of BIA. But this is where we have the inherently federal function rub, and where it has really exacerbated the ability of tribes to do what they know is best for their lands. What I think is so interesting is you ask people in this space, like, what authorities do you think tribes have to manage their own lands? And folks not in this room think, well, it's their lands, they get to do what they want on it. And like in some ways, I know a number of tribes that are like, it is harder to burn on our tribal trust lands than it is to burn on the Joe Schmo rancher down the street. And so that discrepancy is really what we're wrestling with. Inherently federal functions comes up because the federal government and the BIA, at least in California, has largely taken the view that every single step in the process requires BIA to step in and provide approval. So under NFIRMA, that law that I mentioned that governs forestry activities on tribal trust lands, in order to do a traditional prescribed fire, you have to go through many different steps. You first need to have a forest management plan that has gone through the NEPA process and has had full sign-off by the BIA, inherent federal function on that NEPA authority and on that plan approval. You then need to have a prescribed fire plan that is, again, reviewed and approved and signed off on by the BIA. And then if you get through that, and you have to have a fire management plan in place to make sure that fire is managed. Again, tribes can do all the work, BIA has to sign off on it. And then if you get through all of that and you are like looking for the official burn window, that last ignition authorization, inherently federal function, has to be approved by BIA. So tribes that are looking to do this work are facing an agency that doesn't have staffing, doesn't have capacity, doesn't have will to do this, and are just thwarted. So tribes that have tried to go through this process face years of effort to try and get their programs off the ground. And even when they go through those initial planning steps, they stand up a fire program, they get their employees red carded, they can still face that, oh, well, not today, we're not signing that ignition authorization today. And this, I hate to say, is being exacerbated further right now because of the approvals that are now in place under the new Wildland Fire Service. So I'm just I have to look at my notes on this, but basically what they've said, there was a directive that came out about who now has to review on tribal lands, well, really on any lands, because of the split now between BIA as a whole entity and pulling fire over to the Wildland Fire Service. So now, Wildland Fire Service is the one that has to complete technical reviews of burn plans. Both Wildland Fire Service and the BIA will have to sign off on the prescribed fire plan, and the Wildland Fire Service has to sign the ignition authorization. So we now have brought yet another entity into the mix, an entity that is very focused on suppression when you hear all the directives. Sorry, now I'm on my high horse. And so what we see in California is this real tension between the authority that is supposed to be given to tribes in ISDEA and the control that the federal government wants to retain. And I have to say, where I see that tension coming from is this desire at the federal level to protect itself from risk. And it's in part because tribes have successfully asserted mismanagement of trust resources, which they should do, which they are entitled to do, and which those resources have been mismanaged. But because of this fear of mismanagement claims, it means that the agencies are paralyzed from doing anything, which leads to just continued mismanagement of forest lands. And so we have to figure out a way to get out of that cycle, to actually empower agencies, if we're going to leave them having this control, to work with tribes who want that activity to be happening on their lands, or we have to figure out how to pass some of that responsibility and potentially liability or control over to tribes who want to do it. So that's prescribed fire. Then we get to cultural burning, where tribes assert, this is our land, this is our cultural practice, we have a responsibility to this place, and we have done it since time immemorial. And instead of accommodating that or saying that, what you get BIA officers saying is, well, that's an ignition. And if it's an ignition, then what we do is we have this whole NFIRMA process over here for prescribed fire. And wouldn't you like to go ahead and get your NWCG qualified burn boss to do your cultural burning? And tribes are saying, no, that's not cultural burning. That is a different thing entirely. But we are in a very uncertain legal framework on that right now. There are tribes that are doing it. Maybe it's a place where BIA's lack of staffing is helping us out because it's not being, overseen. But it is also a place where tribes, I think, are bearing a certain amount of risk for that. So that is the example I have on where I think that this sort of federal government dynamic is not working for tribes, and where I think this tension between the trust responsibility and the role that the federal government plays in ensuring the protection of Indian forest assets is inherently preventing us from actually managing those assets in a good way. So that's my view on that tension between authority and obligation. So I think we have 10 minutes, 9 minutes. Are there any questions or comments that folks want to make on everything that Sara and I spoke about? Yeah, I totally agree, Cody. It's like we're in a negative feedback loop where because of that lack of resourcing on both the tribal and BIA side, we're therefore not able to continue managing, and it just is exacerbating the problem all the way down.
To Ryan's point about these breach of trust cases, they're really unfortunate because that's probably the pathway I see us going down for the next several decades at minimum. But when you get these breach of trust cases, they're almost always settled with very few strings attached to the settlement money. So although the settlement money is only intended for the damages to the resources, that's not necessarily what these guys are spending it. So again, kind of compounding that resource need within the country.
dealt with that kind of elsewhere with like Bonneville Power, where there's in our area, in the Pacific Northwest, there's a program where the Power Marketing Administration kind of implements its mitigation requirements by giving money to tribes that are affected to buy land and put it into trust. And there have been times where they've wanted easements that were more onerous than we thought were necessary. So that's kind of the inverse, but I've seen it work and I've seen it be a little bit challenging. But I mean, are there your tribe or are you guys doing something similar?
I'm currently a graduate student, so I'm learning this from a Colorado perspective. But again, this is just an question I wanted to ask and see if there's like any interest from my tribe if they're going to utilize this, if they wanted to.
Yeah.
You're seeing a lot of nonprofit groups that are looking for places to park their money, give land to tribes. I think you're going to see more and more of this.
Yeah. I would add to, there's two different components here. One is I work with a lot of tribes and tribal organizations to implement conservation easements. Conservation easements, for those of you that don't know, are a real estate mechanism that allows one party to sort of split off some of the bundle of sticks of a real property to hold and say, these development rights actually are no longer going to be exercised, and we have these affirmative abilities to prevent that use of land. But they can also include affirmative rights. And so some of the things that I think are really interesting are tribes that are holding conservations that not only allow them to protect the land, but to access the land and to engage in a wide variety of stewardship activities, including forestry activities or forest management activities. And so I think they can be a really flexible tool that allows tribes on private land to do things that they might not otherwise be able to, especially if you have an entity that wants to retain the fee ownership of that property. The thing I will also caution, and it's like a place of emerging work, is if tribes are owning lands that are subject to a conservation easement, either by a nonprofit organization or a government entity, and they then want to take that land into trust, it is complicating. So the fee to trust process involves a review of encumbrances on title. Conservation easements are one of those. And so if tribes are looking to eventually take land into trust and apply a lot of the authorities that we talked about today, they have to be very careful about whether they accept a conservation easement or another form of restriction. And that's, in California, we've had a lot of state money that has been making land back a possibility, but it has often come with these restrictions that are going to make it really complicated for those tribes to take that land into trust if they want to.
I was just wondering, you mentioned 10 steps in ITARA to actually establish the process. I was wondering if you could briefly go over kind of what that process is.
Yeah. I was, that might have been an offhand comment about the exact number of steps, but it's many. I'm going to let Brian tell you what they are, though.
Yeah, as I stand here at this moment, I can't identify all the steps. I know that one of them is a pre-application where you have to submit a letter of interest, and that's one of the steps that we're trying to jettison in the amendments. We think that a tribe should be able to put a plan together, submit it to the department, have them either approve it, disapprove it, or allow it to be deemed approved, and then go about your merry way. I feel like that pre-approval process was a holdover of this Indian Trust Reform Act of 2005 that then Senators McCain and Dorgan consulted with Indian Country about. I wasn't thinking it would be used that way, but that's one of the reasons for these amendments. So we're hoping to at least trim it down to maybe 6.
One of the other big ones is that the tribe has to have enacted laws that will govern it, and have those reviewed and approved right before the final proposal can be accepted. So knowing internally that passing tribal ordinances and whatnot can sometimes be a very onerous process, that can be a significant step, even though it's fully within the control of the tribe.
One thing I'll mention too is that ITARA can apply to a direct service tribe as well, and I think the Bureau has sort of told people that it has to be done under a 638 agreement, but it's intended that a direct service tribe could just have its resources managed by the government differently. sure that there are many direct service tribes that sought it, but that's a possibility also.
Oh, all the way in the back, and then you.
Are forestry programs the only programs that are allowed to develop their own regulations under ITARA?
Currently, yes.
And
Well, surface leases.
leasing.
Yeah, okay, great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm in Alaska, so we don't have ITARA. Most of what we have is compacts. And one of the issues we find is that because they're so small, when they compact out the funds, they can't effectively manage them. They'll get like $12,000.
Yes.
You can't hire someone, and then they end up, either coming in and out of the compact or leaning back on us for more funds.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That's why I highlighted, like, we have the laws on the books that sound really great, and then the ways it's been implemented are really preventing self-governance from happening. We've seen line items where it's like, cool, $500, great. What am I going to do with that? And so I think thinking about the funding piece, which is not my area, I know Brian's been doing a lot more work in that, is going to be critical to actually having the goals of ISDIA be realized.
One of the amendments in the amendment package, this specifically with Alaska in mind, in this regionalization issue, is it allows ITAMs to be entered into by tribal organizations under ISDIA, right? So if the tribe delegates to, a natural resource tribal organization, some entity, maybe even an ANC, if they delegate that authority to them to carry out the function, you could then have an entity that could provide, administer ITAMs over multiple tribes.
Well, we haven't seen that where several tribes have been together and create an organization to be scaled to handle that. But not everyone does that. Not everyone agrees to. Some of them don't like their neighbors.
Yes.
Sure.
100%.
It's not limited to Alaska.
Good. Okay, I think we're right at time. Yeah. I don't know what happened. Pete, tell